The Civil War was a result of extreme sectional tensions in the United States. Obviously, slavery was the primary issue. Some opposed slavery on moral grounds, while others remained more concerned about who had more representation, the North or the South. The majority of the population remained nonchalant. The war, in fact, was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. The War of Northern Aggression, as dubbed by the Confederates, ended at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865. The war may have been over, but the Confederates had surrendered reluctantly. While rifles were put aside, tensions were to remain for years to come. New policies were to determine the fate of the freed slaves. They later found that these policies did little to better their lives. Nobody can be certain of what Lincoln's policies would have been for Reconstruction, as he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in 1865. President Johnson took his place and carried out a less than satisfactory Reconstruction plan that allowed for segregation to continue. He sympathized with the South, which was, in fact, his home. The North and the South remained at odds with what they wanted to do. The South agreed to ratify all of the amendments they were required to, but they still viewed themselves as superior to the African Americans and asserted their superiority through Jim Crow laws. Northerners were less concerned about these issues as they began to enter the industrial era. One of the few accomplishments that took place during Reconstruction was the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. All of them concerned former slaves and their new place in society. The 13th ended slavery, the 14th made blacks citizens and gave them all the inherent rights of citizenship, and the 15th extended the right to vote to all men regardless of race. After going on for 12 years, Reconstruction abruptly ended. This was because of the tie between the candidates of 1877, Hayes and Tilden. The South wholeheartedly hated Reconstruction, so they reached an agreement with the North. The North won the presidency, but in return troops had to withdraw from the South, and Reconstruction had to end. African Americans soon reverted back to the lifestyle they had been living before the war. Sharecropping became a common practice. Basically, African Americans now had their own small plots of land. They had to pay a sort of rent for the land they cultivated through a portion of their crops at harvest. While the portion was initially agreed to 20%, it was usually increased to 80% at the time of harvest. This struggle continued for a century. One of the paramount court cases during the time was Plessy v. Ferguson. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal institutions were legal. This essentially continued the oppression that blacks had been facing since their arrival to the United States. This court case fueled the civil rights movement. The 1920s marked an interlude in African Americans' quest for equal rights. After being citizens for about 50 years, blacks migrated north in great numbers in search of jobs. This movement was known as the Great Migration, and blacks literally packed up all of their belongings and went north in search of a new life. The North was known to be more tolerant, and companies often recruited blacks for cheap labor. Once relocated to cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit, blacks enjoyed less segregation. However, they often clashed with the new wave of immigrants, who were also in search of jobs, especially the Irish. From 1910 to 1960, 6 million African Americans ventured north to enjoy their lives away from the places they were once held captive. This Great Migration inspired a cultural movement known as the Harlem Renaissance. African Americans began to express themselves using a multitude of media. Jazzeros and prominent musicians included Duke Ellington and Jelly Roll Morton. The movement was a promotion of progressive ideas. Racial discrimination was extremely pervasive, and the Harlem Renaissance was the African Americans' response to the widespread hate. It was when African Americans, especially individuals, developed a culture that had eluded them for the past 300 years. Prominent authors such as Langston Hughes and artists such as Jacob Lawrence described the era in their work. It was essentially a revival of African American culture. A great milestone in the African Americans' quest to obtain equal rights was the desegregation of the armed forces. In World War I, African Americans fought in segregated units, though they had fought in wars as early as the Revolutionary War. In World War I, they served in completely segregated units, and only 2 combat divisions existed for blacks. African Americans were seen as more suited for manual labor than combat, and a majority of them aided the war effort in factories rather than on the field. World War II saw a change in blacks' involvement in the armed forces. President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 to completely integrate the armed forces and guarantee equality regardless of race, color, religion, or natural origin. The next step on the road to equality was overturning the Supreme Court ruling that separate institutions were equal, which was not the case at all. In the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court ended segregation in all public places, declaring that separate institutions were inherently unequal. This met much criticism from whites and ended de jure, or by law, segregation. The end of de jure segregation was an important legal step for equality. However, the real problem that blacks faced was de facto segregation, which was basically segregation based on culture rather than law. Rosa Parks was a victim of this form of segregation and was arrested for not giving up her seat on the bus to a white man. Her arrest garnered a lot of attention and catalyzed the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was the most prominent leader of the civil rights movement. His peaceful protests and evocative speeches moved some to tears. The most famous peaceful march was the March on Washington, when King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. His speech brought to light the importance of the civil rights movement and made civil rights a topic discussed nationally. Another key part of the civil rights movement were the sit-ins, which were ways of protesting that didn't involve moving. Sit-ins were usually nonviolent and were an easy way to gain attention from media and the government. Some of the most well-remembered sit-ins were the Greensboro sit-ins in North Carolina. While they were not the first sit-ins, they garnered a lot of attention for African Americans and their struggle for equal rights. Malcolm X was a prominent figure in the second half of the civil rights movement. The cry for equal rights soon changed to one for black power. Organizations like the Black Panthers embraced self-defense and more militant rhetoric. Malcolm X was a prominent leader of the Nation of Islam that advocated black separatism. After visiting Mecca, he converted to mainstream Islam and abandoned his more extreme ideals before he was assassinated. Thurgood Marshall was a key part of the civil rights movement and in some ways marked its end. Marshall started off the movement by teaming with the NAACP to help overturn the separate but equal ruling from the 19th century. Later he was appointed by President Lyndon B. Johnson as the 96th Associate Justice, the first African American to receive the honor. Marshall's appointing marked a milestone in the civil rights movement as it was the beginning of blacks having political power. The civil rights movement was one of the most successful Reformation movements and stemmed from Reconstruction. Thank you.